Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. When I first read this morning's gospel text in preparation for today's sermon, I breathed a bit of a resigned sigh. Of course, Father Ted would ask me to preach about one of the more challenging parables. Then I remembered that today is In-Gathering Sunday, which means that I get to preach about money on the same Sunday that we are asking you to commit a portion of your resources to the mission of our church. So clearly, Father Ted wanted one of the unpaid clergy to tackle this one. After all, a conventional theological reading of this parable treats it as a passage on stewardship. The talents are likened to the gifts, skills, and resources granted to us by God. And we are taught that we must be responsible and accountable to God by putting those gifts to work rather than burying them. And yet, despite this parable's appearance during the traditional stewardship season of churches across the nation, I'm not so sure that this parable means what we think it means. So let's start, at the beginning. A man goes on a journey, and before he goes, he entrusts each of 3 slaves with some talents. In Jesus' day, a talent was not a type of coin, but rather a measure of weight that fell somewhere between 80 and 130 pounds. It's difficult to know precisely how much money the man is giving the slaves without knowing the composition and therefore weight of the currency. But suffice to say that a talent was equivalent to roughly 20 years of an average person's wages. So the first slave receives 5 talents. Taking into account the current average income in our country, that would be about $5 million in today's currency. The second servant receives 2 talents, which would be about $2 million. The third servant receives only 1 talent. And by only, I mean only $1 million. Now these are massive amounts of money that we are talking about. The only people that had that kind of money at that time were the wealthy elite. So we know that the man at the beginning of this story has a lot of money to work with. And how would he have made that money? Well, the usual ways. He would have engaged in trade, sent goods to market, ran import-export businesses, or lent money to people and charged interest. We should note as well that it was not at all uncommon in that time for such wealthy individuals to take frequent trips away from home in order to pursue profitable business pursuits. Thus, it was necessary for the wealthy to employ individuals to look after things on the home front while they were away. These individuals may have been considered slaves, but they were well-placed ones. Domestic bureaucrats, if you will, in charge of managing workers, maintaining books, collecting debts. They were even free to make a little something for themselves on the side once they had seen to their master's interests. And yes, the higher-ups were entrusted with more than the lower downs, but they were all tasked with keeping an eye on things while the master was away. So nothing about this story up until this point is especially surprising, given the context in which it was told. But then the wealthy man returns, and all hell breaks loose. The first 2 slaves offer reports on their progress with the talents, and their master is pleased. "Well done, good and faithful servants," he tells each of them, and invites them to enter into the joy of their master. But things go very differently for the third slave. For the third slave had not multiplied the talent he was given, but had instead kept it buried, for safekeeping. And the master is furious. Now, if you, like me, tend to equate Jesus' parables with stories that illuminate our relationship with God, this fury is more than a little bit troubling. After all, the little m master of the story is surely akin to the capital M master of the universe, right? But consider Rebecca Pippert's explanation of anger in her book, Hope Has Its Reasons. unwise actions or relationships, Rebecca writes. Do we respond with benign tolerance as we might toward strangers? Far from it. Anger isn't the opposite of love. Hate is. And the final form of hate is indifference. God's wrath is not a cranky explosion, but his settled opposition to the cancer which is eating out the insides of the human race that he loves with his whole being. The master then was not angry that the third slave failed to make him more money. He was angry that he didn't try at all, and that in burying his talent, and perhaps his head in the sand, the third slave had missed out entirely on what it means to be cared for by a master who gives so lavishly. Chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew chronicle a time when Jesus has pulled aside his disciples away from the crowds and is speaking privately to only his closest followers. The disciples ask him, "Tell us, what will be the sign of the coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus tells several parables in response, including this parable of the talents. Which means that this story, unlike so many of the stories we have heard before, this story isn't intended to teach religious leaders what they're getting wrong about God, nor is it a generic instruction on who God is. This is a lesson taught to a specific people for a specific purpose. It's a parable on how to be faithful in the in-between. In between the time of Jesus' ascension to heaven following his resurrection and Jesus' return to judge all things at the end of days. So basically, now. The disciples who first heard this, of course, wanted to know when this in-between would end, but that was not for them to know, just as it is not for us to know. For the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, and no one will see it coming. In other words, don't worry about when. Worry instead about how we are to conduct ourselves in the meantime. Worry about how we are to serve God faithfully now. The parable of the talents is a story that shows the element of risk that is intrinsic to the call of God. God is always asking us to step out of our comfort zones and to act out in faith, not in fear. It's what God expected of Noah when he told him to build an ark and collect animals. It's what God expected of Abraham when he told him to leave his home. It's what God expected of Moses at the burning bush and of Mary when he sent the angel Gabriel. Had any of those individuals acted out of their fear instead of faith, the Bible would be a very different book. The difference then between the slaves who invested what they received and the slave who dug a hole to bury his talent is a willingness to have faith instead of succumbing to fear. Why else the clarion call of the scriptures from beginning to end? Do not be afraid. We are called to be people of faith, not people of fear, for so many reasons. For one, we tend to do stupid, ridiculous things when we act out of fear. But even more than that, when we become mired in fear, we lose sight of the fact that God is always with us. Through all the risk of failure, we are not alone. Even in the failures themselves, God is present still, turning our shortcomings into new things we